All right, it is 3:30 and it is Wednesday, September 2nd, and I think we should get going. My name is Andrew Cohen. Thank you all for joining us at this virtual event. And I am the director of the Jean Beer Blumenfeld Center for Ethics at Georgia State University. I also teach in the philosophy department here at Georgia State, and the Blumenfeld Center for Ethics is delighted to bring to our community today's event, Political Protests and the 2020 Elections. It's the first of our 5-part fall series on the ethics of the 2020 elections. In each installment, we bring together noted speakers to campus virtually, and as today, we include experts and scholars from our community. Our events are designed to foster constructive dialogue and reflection about how ethics impacts the choices we make as citizens and as human beings. This series is looking especially at how ethics matters for our ballot choices and how ethics might shape election policy and election administration. We are especially eager to reflect on how ethics of elections matters for historically marginalized communities. There are further details about this series available from our website, ethics.gsu.edu, and allow me to plug the next installment in our series. Next week, same time, Wednesday, September 9th at 3:30 Eastern, will feature a panel discussion on healthcare access and the elections. Please check ethics.gsu.edu for details. This series is made possible with the generous support of our co-sponsors, Georgia Humanities, and the GSU Center for Human Rights and Democracy. We also thank our campus partners in making this event possible, the Panthers Vote Coalition, the Office of Civic Engagement, the Center for Studies on Africa and its Diaspora, the Department of Philosophy, the Center for Law, Health, and Society, and the GSU program in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. Today's program comes to us at an especially challenging time. Throughout the Western world, and certainly in the United States, citizens are taking to the streets to express their outrage at public policy, at what the police are doing or not doing, and at public monuments. Now, some of these events are responses to horrific rights violations against persons from historically marginalized groups. Recently, however, the marches and protests have taken a toll on private and public property. Over the past few months here in Atlanta, groups have appeared in public to protest police actions in Atlanta or elsewhere. And sometimes the protests involve loss of life or property. Earlier in the summer, Atlanta's Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms spoke about the protesters against the death of George Floyd. And in a gripping speech, the mayor talked about how difficult it is for her, as the mother of Black boys, to keep them safe. And she then addressed the protesters. She cautioned that their conduct was not protest, but, as she said, chaos. And she talked about some of the property damage and looting from the protesters. And she said, and I quote, "If you want change in America, go and register to vote. Show up at the polls on June 9th. Do it in November. This is the change we need in this country. You are disgracing our city. You are disgracing the life of George Floyd and every other person who has been killed in this country. We are better than this," close quote. And she then implored the protesters to go home. Now, the mayor there voiced a common view about protest that cause loss of life or property. There are others who warn that protests are just baked into the blood of a country such as the United States. This country, some people will say, was founded by a bunch of people who committed treason. Some 18th century activists tarred and feathered representatives of the British Crown. They destroyed property by throwing it into Boston Harbor. They took up arms against the state. And this tradition has continued over the past over 200 years, where acts that some will call violent are part of what people do as a form of political expression. But the voice of Mayor Bottoms resonates with many critics who believe that there are, in their view, more constructive and more democratic avenues for change. Today, we bring a panel of distinguished guests to talk about political protest, political violence, and political participation. Joining us is Professor Candice Delmas, who teaches philosophy at Northeastern University in Boston. She has published on themes in social and political philosophy, especially including civil disobedience. Also joining us is Natasha Lennard, who is a journalist, author, and teaches at the New School for Social Research in New York City. And joining them on the panel is GSU's own Professor Akinyele Umoja, who teaches in the African American Studies program here. I encourage you to read about our panelists further in the brochure for today's event, which you can find at ethics.gsu.edu or on our Twitter feed at JBB Ethics Center. So the format will be as follows. Each panelist will offer approximately 10 minutes of remarks. There will then be a conversation among the panelists, and we will draw on questions from the attendees. So we encourage you, please submit your question in the Q&A spot on WebEx, or if you'd like, you can post it to the Twitter feed for the Jean Beer Blumenfeld Center for Ethics, which you can find again at JBB Ethics Center. That's at JBB Ethics Center. So we're going to begin with our first set of remarks by Professor Candice Delmas. Among Professor Delmas's publications is the recent work, A Duty to Resist, When Disobedience Should Be Uncivil, from Oxford University Press. Dr. Delmas's remarks are titled, What a Protest Should Look Like, Civility and Its Discontents. Thank you, Dr. Delmas.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you so much for this invitation, and I really look forward to our conversation. So I too will start with Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottom's statement from May 29, 2020, in which she condemned the unrest of the previous night. I will take her position as representative of the dominant view regarding protests. Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden expressed a similar view on Monday as he condemned the violence involved in demonstrations around the country. So what did Mayor Bottom say? First, she denied the unrest, which included vandalism and looting qualified as protest, as you noted, Andrew, saying it was chaos. Biden likewise said rioting is not protesting, it's lawlessness, plain and simple. Two, she told participants they had lost all credibility because of the violence. Three, she called on participants to go vote instead of riot if they want to effect change. Four, she unfavorably compared the unrest with the civil rights movement. Quote, "This is not in the spirit of Martin Luther King Jr. This is chaos. If you care about the city, then go home and pray that somebody like Reverend Beasley will come and talk to you to give you some instructions on what a protest should look like and how you effect change in America." Unquote. So my remarks will focus on these instructions on what a protest should look like, which I'll present and critique. So according to this dominant view, there is a proper and right way of protesting that can effect lasting political change, and there is a wrong way. So what should a protest look like and why? The answer lies in what I call the civil disobedience playbook. That is the public understanding and standard liberal philosophical account of civil disobedience that was shaped in the aftermath of the civil rights movement and that is intertwined with the official narrative of the movement. So I'll briefly present each element, the civil disobedience playbook and the official narrative, before situating today's protest relative to this dominant view. Civil disobedience is widely understood as a conscientious breach of law undertaken to persuade the majority to change a law or policy in a reasonably just, basically legitimate society. For a disobedient act to be civil, it must satisfy the following 4 marks of civility. The first one is publicity. Agents are to act publicly, that is, give authorities fair notice, act in the open, and appeal to the community's shared conception of justice, something like the principles of political morality embedded in the US Constitution. The second mark of civility is non-violence. Agents cannot harm people or damage property or threaten to do either. And my co-panelists will talk more about non-violence. The third mark is legal non-evasion. Agents must willingly accept and even invite the legal consequences of their action, including arrest, prosecution, and punishment. Finally, the fourth mark of civility are called decorum. It's the idea that agents must act in a courteous and dignified manner and show themselves to be respectable and worthy. And that came out in Mayor Bottom's remarks. So a disobedient act that satisfies these criteria is disciplined and legible as a protest. It does not threaten the social order. It is not chaos or lawlessness, as Mayor Bottoms and Biden noted. It can be seen as faithful to law and respectful of democratic processes. So the civil disobedience playbook is the script that protesters must follow if they want to draw attention to an issue by breaking the law. It demands civility and affirms that only civil disobedience is acceptable and can be effective because only it can persuade the majority. Any disobedient protest that falls short of these demands, that is uncivil, is supposed to be doomed to fail because A, it will alienate the public, B, it will excuse or justify violent police repression. The theory of civil disobedience works hand in hand in the United States with the official narrative of the civil rights movement. The latter offers a romantic, idealized, historically inaccurate version of the civil rights movement that functions to deter resistance in the present. So let me explain. First, the official narrative distorts political reality. It obscures the fact that civil rights activists elected civil disobedience for strategic or tactical reasons, not because they wanted to demonstrate their endorsement of the system's legitimacy. It ignores the contributions of radical groups and ideologies to the Black freedom struggle, or else presents them as impediments to the nonviolent civil rights movement. So the Black Panther Party, Black nationalism, Pan-Africanism, Black workers' movements, among many others, had many adherents and showed what Black emancipation and self-reliance looked like. Far from obstructing the civil rights movement, they also allowed King to present civil rights legislation as the only palatable alternative. Second, the official narrative functioned as a counter-resistance ideology to deter resistance altogether and buttress the status quo. It overstates the victory of the civil rights movement as crystallized in the civil rights legislation of the 1960s, wrongly suggesting racial justice has been achieved, when in fact many of the same social ills, including economic and health disparities, school and residential segregation, and police brutality, have largely remained unaddressed. The official narrative celebrates submission by praising nonviolent activists who absorb violence without striking back, to the point of making self-defense out of bounds. In the process, it conceals state-authored and state-condoned violence, including white supremacist terror and police brutality. The perpetual demands for civility ignore and obscure the differentials of power, the fact that it is easy for those in power and harder for entrenched minorities to speak and to be listened to, and therefore to be civil. So contemporary protest movements are systematically judged harshly in comparison with the idealized civil rights activists, and therefore they're branded uncivil and counterproductive. In these ways, the official narrative is used to cast a negative light on contemporary protest movements and prejudice the public against them. So many commentators have noted the continuity between the civil rights movement and the movement for Black lives, including the fact that activists then, as now, were considered impatient and uncivil troublemakers, and of course the parallels between the urban uprisings of 1968 and today. But I want to speak to the differences, and especially today's movement's deliberate departure from the civil disobedience playbook. Black Lives Matter activists have sought a new path for their movement with the slogan, "Not your grandfather's civil rights movement." They are the children of King and Malcolm X. They deploy mass civil disobedience tactics and try to work within the legal system on the one hand, and embrace Black power. Black pride, self-reliance, and defiance on the other end, which whites construe as incivility. Many Black Lives Matter protests have been peaceful and civil, but there have also been many instances of vandalism, looting, and rioting in Atlanta and elsewhere, some but not all as a result of far-right infiltrators. Protesters defaced and toppled Confederate monuments. In some cities, guerrilla artists replaced these with new monuments. Local police and National Guard forces have quelled the protests with tear gas, batons, and rubber bullets. Armed white nationalist militias have attacked Black Lives Matter protesters, killing 2 in Kenosha, Wisconsin. To protect themselves and others from police and counter-protesters' violence, demonstrators wear goggles, helmets, and homemade shields. They use leaf blowers against tear gas and carry milk and antacids as remedies for the effects of pepper spray. We are far from the civil disobedience playbook, which demands activists absorb blows to demonstrate their commitment and worthiness. Protesters do not apologize for their expressions of defiance, grief, and rage. They do not shy away from giving offense either with virulent anti-police signs and chants. This kind of incivility stands in direct opposition to the lofty demands of the virtue of civility in the public discourse, which is supposedly premised on the recognition of each other as democratic equals. The current uprising denounces the pretense of democratic equality and highlights the reality of racial oppression by flouting civility. It denounces whites' demand of Black civility as unfair, given the lack of care and concern for Black suffering. The movement, I think, does not seek consensus or compromise, does not seek moral suasion, it does not seek to modify white sensibility. And yet maybe, just maybe, it has done these things and more. So I want to end with the striking fact that the protests appear to refute the received wisdom that nonviolence and civility are essential to the success of social movements and that their opposites are counterproductive. According to the latest Gallup poll, 65% of US adults support the protests. An estimated 6 to 10% of the US population participated in protests this summer, making it perhaps the largest movement in US history. I'm not predicting the success of this movement. The situation is volatile and there could be a backlash, but the summer's uprisings show that incivility is no barrier to mass participation and popular support. And at least it looks like the repertoire of protests in America is expanding. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Delmas. If we were doing this in the real world, there would be applause. Next up is Natasha Lennard. Among her publications is Being Numerous, Essays on Non-Fascist Life with Verso Press. Please read more about Natasha Lennard in the event brochure on our website, ethics.gsu.edu, or on our Twitter feed at JBB Ethics Center. It's also a place where you can submit questions as well as put it into the Q&A feed on WebEx. Natasha Lennard's remarks are titled Rejecting Protest Narratives.
Hi there. I hope that my video is coming through okay. I feel like I've been blinking in and out. But hi, thank you for having us, GSU. Thank you for organizing this. Professor, thank you so much for kicking us off, Professor Delmas. I realize that my comments are very much going to echo, but I hope that means compliment yours and into a little bit more about questions around looting and property, and then also addressing a little bit further what Professor Delmas touched upon with questions of how we delineate violence and non-violence, who gets to make those delineations, and how they persist in mainstream, largely liberal and conservative media narratives. So to begin with, I'm going to take you across the pond to where I quite obviously am from in England. So in 2011, for 1 week in August, London was ablaze with riots after the police had shot dead a young man named Mark Duggan, who was an unarmed Black Londoner. And the tabloids were sticky with panic of classist, racist condemnations of these roaming packs of hooligans engaging in opportunistic rioting. The police cracked down, as we see them crack down here, with an immense series of repressive arrests and violence, 3,000 plus arrests in 5 days. Then came the brooms. In the wake of the unrest, hundreds of very well-meaning British civilians took to the streets in a different way. They were armed with brooms, voluntarily sweeping up the debris of the preceding rage-filled days. The organizers and a lot of the media dubbed it the Great Cleanup. It was a blunt, puritanical assertion that goodness, indeed greatness, fell on the side of the largely white middle-class citizens who would wipe clean the charred evidence of social unrest left by those underclasses. Of course, studies then found that structural racism, classism, habitual police brutality, all were the undergirding forces driving the riotous rupture that we saw. But at the time, the same pernicious narratives we're all so used to, especially this summer, took hold and were established, pitting criminal, violent rioters against upstanding broom brigades. And the then Prime Minister, David Cameron, he called the riots criminality pure and simple. Of course, nothing was pure and simple about those events, and it is striking how often we hear the decriers of riotous rupture bring in the exact same phraseology, pure and simple. I believe that Biden has been using that term this week numerous times. We saw the same line play out during the rebellions 5 years ago in Ferguson and Baltimore, and again now in these vast and potent nationwide uprisings from Minnesota to Kenosha and beyond. We're told the protests turn violent. Racists and reactionaries call it thuggery, pure and simple, and liberals, politicians especially, and media commentators who believed themselves to be on the right side of anti-racist struggle condemn the violent protesters, but they stress the presence of good, non-violent, civil, as Professor Delmas brought up, demonstrators who march and mourn, but they do not riot and loot. So there's a desire in these delineations to rescue these uprisings from any demonizing narratives of violence, criminality, and liberal voices, albeit maybe unwittingly, although I don't want to be that generous, perform their own violent categorization. By doing this, author Vicky Osterweil, who has written a much discussed book that came out last week called In Defense of Looting, speaks very well to this point. She writes, and I quote, "In making a strong division between good protesters and bad protesters, or between ethical nonviolence practitioners and supposedly violent looters, the narrative of the criminalization of Black youth is reproduced. This time, it delineates certain kinds of Black youth, those who loot versus those who protest. The effect of this discourse is hardening a permanent category of criminality on Black subjects who produce a supposed crime within the context of protest." End quote. Osterweil's defense of rioting and looting isn't a condemnation of the historic contributions that activists who do engage in disciplined nonviolence in the tradition of MLK took up. And of course, in his time, it was the very white moderates, more committed to order than to justice, who were so ready to condemn MLK too. So Osterweil stresses that nonviolent civil disobedience did have a role, an important one, but we can maintain that while rejecting the view that counterposes those who riot and loot as bad protesters. Rioting in the context of anti-racist, anti-fascist struggle is not senseless destruction. It is often, even if there isn't a named and cited intention, there is always a deeply political challenge to property and white supremacy, two concepts intractably entwined in this former slaveholder republic. Indeed, some of the most important historic acts of looting were slaves stealing themselves away. Only when rendered in the language of capital are the acts of smashing chain store windows or cop car windows sufficient to see a protest deemed violent, but this language of capital is the media lingua franca. But no discussions of violence should ever skip over the fact that white supremacists and the far right are responsible for 3/4 of extremist killings in the last decade. The great theorist and author of Black Marxism, Cedric Robinson, also reminds us that the history of Black liberation struggle in this country, from slave revolts to the building of Marinage communities onwards, always, yes, certainly involved some physical violence. It had to ensure escape and sustain freedom. But a remarkably small amount, if you put it in context, of retributive killings were carried out against white enslavers and oppressors. This is also true if we consider even the actions of the Black Liberation Army. Actually, very, very few assassinations carried out against oppressive police officers, considered how violent these movements and their most militant wings have been considered. Mainstream commentary on riots, especially those carried out by young Black and poor people, focus often on targets, the choice of targets of what gets damaged. And there's, of course, more sympathy for the act of smashing a Walmart window than like a local mom and pop store. And certainly, I'd rather see a retail giant famed for worker abuses smashed and burned than I would a small local business. But let's not pretend all small local businesses are somehow exempt from worker abuses. Yet, though I get sympathy for those small businesses, is crucial and understandable, but at the same time, it does not entail denying the political force or even the necessity of a riot. And we've seen again and again in recent weeks, small business owners themselves standing in front of their own burnt out shop windows, asserting the validity of the actions that led to that loss for them. I believe that to tell a furious community that their riotous actions are counterproductive is patronizing, and it patronizes the very groups who know too well that acceptable channels of political engagement have failed again and again to deliver dignity and justice to Black life. It also upholds the baseless, historically racist outside agitator myths by which Trump and others right now are attempting to delegitimize Black-led uprisings while legitimizing sweeping repression. It also ignores, as Professor Delmas noted and as the author Osterweil does, that major riots and the threat of more major riots during the civil rights era helped force JFK's hand in signing historic legislation. As Osterweil writes again, to argue that the movement, the civil rights movement, achieved what it did in spite of, rather than as a result of, the mixture of nonviolent and violent action is spurious at best. So beyond questions of justifying riots or not, I believe a categorical error is made in any narrative that rests on this idea of the violent turn in these protests. The very idea of the current demonstrations turning violent mislocates and misframes violence in these contexts. The error exists in a tacit suggestion that there was a situation of non-violence or peace from which to turn. To be clear, and I think this should be clear, any circumstance in which cops take Black life with impunity, any context in which it is still necessary to state at all that Black lives matter, is a background state of constant violence. So riotous protesters do not bring violence. The violence was there in the DNA of white supremacy and our world through which it permeates. Even, and this is rare, when the media does report on police turning violent during protests, Even that rhetoric I find misleading because it ignores the fact that policing as an institution in this country functions as a constant and consistent violence against Black life. It doesn't turn violent. So shows of militarized policing, tanks and tear gas on US soil, they draw rightful public outrage. But quotidian policing is then not marked as a violence. State of peace peppered with violent turns, a lie that could only ring true for America's white and privileged. As Angela Davis said in 1972 in a famed interview, if you are a Black person and live in the Black community all your life and walk out on the street every day seeing white policemen surrounding you, and when you live under a situation like that constantly, and then you ask me, whether I approve of violence, I mean, that just doesn't make any sense at all. The institutions and, end quote, the institutions and vectors of white supremacy have turned turning to violence to the people who are literally not permitted to turn from it, whose lives and deaths are all too organized by it. Why not end the cycle? Could be a question, but our question is it not cruel to demand peace from those who are not permitted to live in it? I repeat here the words of late philosopher Bernard Williams to finish, and he said, to say peace when there is no peace is to say nothing. Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha Lennard, for those very provocative and engaging remarks. Next up is GSU's own Professor Akinyele Umoja. Among Dr. Umoja's publications is We Will Shoot Back, Armed Resistance in the Mississippi Freedom Movement from NYU Press. You can read more about Dr. Umoja's life and work on our event brochure at ethics.gsu.edu or on our Twitter feed at JBB Ethics Center. Dr. Umoja's remarks are titled Narratives of Nonviolence and Spontaneous Rebellion, Correctly Categorizing Armed Resistance in the Black Freedom Struggle. Dr. Umoja.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks for that introduction and hosting this. And I also want to thank the Blumenfeld Center for Ethics and other sponsoring organizations, and to say I'm honored to be in this panel with scholars of the quality of Professor Delmas and Lennard. My presentation will focus, and I'm going to share a screen with you if it's possible. Or looks like it might not be possible. I'm trying. Looks like it might not be possible, but I'm just go ahead. I wanted to share a few images with you. Looks like I lost it. But my presentation will focus on critique of two narratives in response to the insurgents and protests in the streets of Atlanta. I argue these narratives distort the history of the Black freedom movement. The two narratives constantly used this summer to condemn insurgent politics were, number one, that the civil rights movement was nonviolent. That's the exclusive way that the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s is seen. Number two, that violence never got us anywhere. These two narratives were particularly employed not only during the protests, but during memorial tributes to Congressman John Lewis. It was oftentimes said that John Lewis's example as a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, his heroic actions in freedom rides, as well as the sit-ins, should be the model that protesters in the streets of Atlanta should utilize. Also, as was stated earlier, the response by Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms to local uprisings in response to the death of John Floyd. In both cases, peaceful protest was framed as the only legitimate form of resistance, and quote unquote voting was presented as the only means to bring about social change. And I'll give a few examples from my book, We Will Shoot Back, to offer examples that challenge these narratives. Number one, that the civil rights movement was nonviolent. The civil rights movement, of course, utilized a variety of tactics, including litigation, nonviolent direct action, but also utilize economic coercion, boycotts, and things of that nature, but also armed resistance, particularly armed self-defense, was necessary for the survival and success of the Black freedom movement throughout the South, but I particularly focused in Mississippi. The first nonviolent activists came to Mississippi in 1961. Robert Moses comes to Mississippi to organize a voter registration campaign. The campaign would not have been successful without local people who provided Bob Moses and other nonviolent civil rights activists with protection. They weren't going to be protected by police. They weren't going to be protected, and oftentimes weren't protected by the federal government. In fact, one one journalist who would come to Mississippi during the 1950s, even prior to Bob Moses coming to Mississippi, a journalist for Jet Magazine, Simeon Booker, would state, a successful campaign for rights in Mississippi employs weapons, employs guns. Let me give you the exact quote. Hold on. It was going to be on my slide. He said, firearms, protection, and security are ingredients of a successful civil rights program in Mississippi. The Negro social reformer must defend himself because he has no protection from police, sheriffs, or state troopers. The reason why many more Negro civil rights are not killed is because they are armed to defend themselves and their family. This is what he said in 1955. But even after that, other members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, members of the Congress of Racial Equality, and organizing in Mississippi around voter registration campaigns were protected throughout the Mississippi Delta, throughout all rural areas of Mississippi. One of my classic stories is in 1964 during Freedom Summer, when Black people attempted to go register to vote in a place called Tallahatchie County, Mississippi. This is the county where Emmett Till was lynched. But in 1964, an 86-year-old grandmother armed her children and grandchildren, and she also organized the nonviolent SNCC people to be able to repel attack by night riders. And she herself had prepared Molotov cocktails, firebombs, to ward off the attackers. But throughout the movement, it's pretty clear without people with guns. But let's get to the question, the second proposition. The violence never got us anywhere. And one of the cases in Mississippi that I found quite compelling to challenge that notion was in Macomb, Mississippi, 1964. Macomb during that particular time, and Macomb is in the southern part of the state. It's midway between Jackson, Mississippi, and New Orleans. But Macomb during that time, 1964, after Freedom Summer, was known as the bombing capital of the world. There were 12 bombings between June 22nd and August 12th of that year, primarily done by the United Klans of America. And to show the response of the federal government in the midst of this bombing campaign, in August of 1964, the FBI, in the midst of this bombing campaign, decreased its contingent in Macomb from 16 agents to 4, showing that, it was very much a priority to them. On September 20th of that year, there was a bombing of a home of a Black woman who was a local entrepreneur and supporter of the movement, a woman by the name of Eileen Quinn. After the bombing of Mrs. Quinn's home, since she was so loved in the community, there's what I call a spontaneous rebellion. Those of us in the Black radical tradition prefer that terminology to riot, which is more a term used by the corporate media. But this spontaneous uprising took place with Black people without a plan at all, went out and start sniping, start destroying businesses, taking merchandise from businesses, fighting back against the police. And even though there was no federal response to this situation prior to the September 20th bombing, the next day, President Lyndon Johnson, after the spontaneous rebellion, would call in Mrs. Quinn, a couple of other leaders of the movement in Macomb, Mississippi. They met with President Johnson the next day. He was able to fly him into Washington, D.C. They not only met with President Johnson, the representatives from the Department of Justice. Johnson, in turn, after meeting with them, contacted the Mississippi governor, Paul Johnson, and he threatened to send federal troops to Mississippi. Within 9 days, 11 Ku Klux Klanmen were arrested for the bombings. And so this is a response to, again, a spontaneous rebellion of Black people. That was the pressure. That was what provided the attention of the government to finally respond to all these bombings that were going on. So with that being said, let me close by quoting Martin Luther King, of all people, right? Martin Luther King said what? He said, "It's not enough for me to stand before you tonight and condemn riots. It would be morally irresponsible for me to do that without at the same time condemning the contingent, intolerable conditions that exist in our society. These conditions are the things that cause individuals to feel that they have no other alternative than to engage in violent rebellions to get attention." And so this kind of shatters that notion that nothing was ever accomplished. In fact, King says, for those who don't see voting as an alternative, to those who, because of structural racism in this society, options have been closed off, they see this spontaneous resistance as a form to challenge their oppression. And I think these questions, the overall question happening today, the whole overall discussion is very important in light of what's happening today in Portland, where first you had President Trump sending federal troops to try to stop protests in Portland. And then on the other hand, you have paramilitary supporters out in the street. It comes at a critical time when we see the possibility as the United States is moving toward rule and American form of fascism. So it's important for us not to condemn this resistance, but to try to speak for it. And I'll close with quoting Frantz Fanon. He said, "Our historic mission is to sanction all revolts, all desperate actions, all those abortive attempts drowned in rivers of blood." And that was a great Frantz Fanon. And it's important for scholars like my colleagues on this panel who provide a context for this resistance, for us not to condemn the resistance, but to understand it and politicize and help move toward a united front against this authoritarian fascism. Thank you.
Thank you for those excellent remarks, Dr. Umoja. And I want to thank all the panelists for your superb contributions to get this conversation going. This is just one part of this ongoing conversation about the appropriate vehicles for people to achieve their political preferences and to fight against injustice. Before we turn to the Q&A that people might wish to offer. And let me again remind people who are attending, if you'd like to ask a question, you can put it up on the Q&A in WebEx or find us on Twitter at JBB Ethics Center and put it up there. Before we go to that, it seems as though all three of you are doing a fantastic job at stepping back and asking us to think about the way that people think about what sometimes is called violent protest. And each of you in your own ways are critiquing a narrative that people will sometimes offer about violent protest and asking that perhaps we might wish to reframe it. And before I pose any questions, I wanted to offer each of you the opportunity to ask one another any questions or offer any quick comments. Natasha.
I actually have a question for either of you, really, maybe both of you. We touched upon how so many mainstream commentators and mainstream politicians, especially now this year, are saying, "Hey, look, just please vote. Be civil, yes, do your protest, but vote, vote, vote." And I'm curious how you guys respond when you're faced with people saying that to you, given, you know, the obscene levels, let alone of disenfranchisement in this country, given felony disenfranchisement, other ways that, you know, especially the deeply racist bent of disenfranchisement in this country. How do you answer that when people throw that in your face? Because I get this put at me a lot. So I'm curious how you guys deal with that question or that demand.
Well, from my perspective, people should vote. And one of the things that's done in this country, we're becoming more and more aware of the role of voter suppression, right? And that certain forces are trying to limit particularly Black and brown people from going to the polls. So it's necessary, I think, for us to fight for more democracy and more rights. At the same time, point out that there's other change that happens besides going to the polls, to not limit us to that being our only expression to try to bring about social change. Here in, I live in DeKalb County, Georgia, and we've had for years a Confederate statue. And young people began to protest to get rid of that Confederate statue years ago, and nothing happened around it. But with these latest series of protests, it's no longer there. Now they're going to erect a statue of John Lewis. That didn't happen through voting. Voting was critical because some of the folks who were on the county commission were able to get rid of that and be sensitized to that. But you had people who were opposed to it before who shifted their perspective, given the nature of the protests. So it's I never want to promote that voting is not important. In fact, we need to, in my opinion, vote to get somebody out of office come November. But we will still have a fight, and that's the question too. That just because you know, I like to remind my students. Wonder who was president? Barack Obama. So, you know, electing Barack Obama was not enough, right? That we have to engage in other forms of political activity on the local and national level. And I'm sorry, Candice, I'm talking too much. Go ahead.
Yeah.
No problem.
Yeah,
Professor Delmas.
Thank you. So it's of course a false dilemma to set up, you know, voting or protesting as two paths of action that are parallel, don't meet, and have nothing to do with each other. If the broad question is how to effect change, then we need to vote and we need to protest, and we don't just need to vote and protest, we need to organize and we need to mobilize, and we need to look at all the obstacles that go in the way of people voting. We need to help people vote. So even President Obama, who has also condemned the violence involved in the demonstration, has said that you needed to do both, that both mattered. I think that way of looking at it makes it as if citizens' main political responsibility was to go vote every 4 years, and that was your job and there was nothing else to do. I think it is an important civic duty to go vote, but one civic political duty goes well beyond that in everyday life and in political and grassroots organizing and so on. So that's usually the answer I get.
Thank you, Professor Delmas. To continue the discussion a little bit, I wanted to ask the speakers a question that's following up a little bit on what Professors Delmas and Umoja were just talking about voting. It seems as though all three of you had, if not sympathy with violence as a vehicle for change, perhaps a better way of putting it would be urging people to engage in careful critique of the critics of violence, asking people to think about how we frame political protest and how we should understand it. And just as we were talking about, there are many viewers who are young persons who are newly empowered to participate politically by voting. And Professor Delmas was just saying, as well as Professor Umoja, be careful about suggesting to people that voting is not important, because it may be very important. But I wonder if somebody hearing this this discussion about the significance of protest historically and today as a vehicle for expressing outrage and injustice, whether such persons may then just give up on the, as you might call it, standard version of political participation, and then feel perhaps inspired, if not empowered, to engage in protests that they wouldn't otherwise have engaged in, to take steps they might not otherwise have taken.
That's certainly possible. That people might feel that, wow, we need to be involved in more radical action. In fact, that's historically happened, right? I think the thing that it's important to point out is where voting does make a difference. I think of, and again, looking at the movement, I went to the Freedom Summer reunion in 2014. I think it was the 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer. And Jamil Al-Amin, who many people know in Atlanta, also known as H. Rap Brown, who's in prison now. And he was needed to be moved to a different facility because the prison they had him in was one of these where you're locked up 23 hours. You only get to exercise 1 hour. It's called a control unit. It's the Florence ADX, which is called the lowest of the low prison in the United States. But SNCC people at that conference began to organize to get him moved. And they appealed to Congressman Benny Thompson, who was then Congressman Benny Thompson put pressure on the Bureau of Prisons, and he was moved to a better facility, possibly saved his life, where he's moved to a place where he could have more healthy conditions. Like Benny Thompson, you wouldn't be able to do that. So even for folk who are radical, the vote sometimes and having access to sympathetic elected officials sometimes can make a difference. And that's just a small example. But I think so. What I attempt to do, and I truly believe that Malcolm X said, by any means necessary, that you have to look at the variety of tools that an activist and a radical can even use to bring about change or even to improve the situation that they find themselves in.
Thank you. I'm looking at some of the questions that are popping up, and they're all excellent questions. And one theme that's coming up in many questions is how to understand the definitions of the terms that are showing up in many of these narratives. And several people, independently of one another, have been wondering how the panelists would suggest that we should define certain key terms, such as riot or violence. And I wonder if y'all have any thoughts about how we might best understand those key terms that are showing up in these narratives.
I can take that.
Please.
But in part also because I wanted to ask Natasha about the media coverage of those terms. So, Professor Umoja noted that in the radical Black tradition, the term spontaneous uprising is preferred to the term riot, right? So some of the concepts are somewhat neutral, like a demonstration. Most of them are normatively laden. They carry with them a certain judgment about the acceptability of the very action that they describe. So demonstrations usually mean that they are peaceful until there is a law enforcement coming and requesting everyone to disperse as a matter of public order. I define civil disobedience in the civil disobedience playbook as an act of law breaking for the purpose of producing change that is public, non-violent, non-invasive of law enforcement, and that is broadly courteous. And so I define uncivil disobedience as its opposites. I did see what were some of the concepts that were asked to? Sorry, protest in general. Protest, I think, is the broadest umbrella to talk about what we're talking about here. But yeah, so I would love to hear what Natasha has to say about journalist ethics, right? The code of conduct on how to cover these protests, because a lot of social scientific research shows that how the media covers the events, be they uprising, riots, or some other terms, really matters for public perception, and that will in turn matter to the success of the movement and to effecting the change that activists are seeking to achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's often for both, writers in the media commentators, and any of us just in like regular parlance, it's this really, and those of us who are also involved in activism, this really interesting question of whether you use a different term or like try and subvert a term for your own purposes, and the questions of which is more effective and successful and to what ends, I think are always going to be really fraught questions that we as communities in struggle have to keep asking ourselves and asking those most harmed. But in the media, I mean, it's for the most part, and I've worked in different places, from like being a columnist at the Intercept, where I can pretty much use language and get it. The way that the standard issue framework talks about police violence and police murders in the first place has just been, even up to this day, is just appalling. One of the most evil euphemisms, I believe, in journalism is officer-involved shooting. You'll note that most news journalism insists upon the active tense, aside from when police shoot someone in the back of the head when they're lying on a subway platform. If it's a young Black man, it is an officer-involved shooting. These are unacceptable turns of phrase that I think need to be abolished as a part of any abolition movement. That sort of rhetoric of understanding where violence is located absolutely needs to be abolished from the media. I don't see that happening anytime soon, but there have been some improvements, largely, I think, in a response to Trump, because it is easy for a mainstream liberal media to name him as the baddie and reorient how they discuss their politics and their language around it against him. But I also think because of the potency of Black Lives Matter organizing and the ongoing uprisings, that has, I think, as much, if not more, shifted the way we talk about a broader struggle for abolition and how the newspapers understand this. Slow progress. But we do see the New York Times use the word racist as opposed to these horrible euphemisms like racially inflected. So that's kind of marginal improvements there, but still, I believe, is at an unacceptable level. We don't really hear the mainstream news talk about the Ferguson Rebellion or the uprisings. And those are the kind of words I think that are deserved and like I like to use at the very least. Violence and non-violence, again, is very tricky because obviously violence is often used to describe something that is kind of corporate property damage or window smashing, that I don't think the word violence should be applied. But that's not because I don't think you could describe, you know, the damaging of a non-conscious object as violence. I think there is violence in mass environmental degradation, the decimation of lands. So I do think we have to talk about violence in terms of, can we make sense of victimhood here and what kind of harm is being perpetrated? So the line for me, and I'm hardly alone in this, is not, was it a person or animal harmed? It's not about inanimate or inanimate objects. It's about, you know, which actions produce and perpetuate which kinds of harms in the world and which kind of subjectivities of victim you know, oppressor. So I'm interested in or thinking about what we name violence or non-violence that way. But honestly, most just news journalism, I don't think is particularly engaged in thinking theoretically about the application of these terms. And I think that's a huge problem because, as you say, it does do all too much to inform how the public responds to these events.
I love what was just said, and I think that social movements and oppressed peoples have the necessity and responsibility to name and define things for themselves, and I think some of that's happened with the last movement or the current movement. You know, for me as a 66-year-old Black man, to hear people talk about systemic racism. I mean, you know, that term connected to institutional racism, people have been struggling about that terminology for years. And now I see it thrust on the scene where I see National Basketball Association basketball players using that term. Is just amazing. But but the whole question of definition, it reminds me of a trip I took, a delegation of scholars from Georgia State, and we went to Argentina. And many of the people in Argentina were reflecting on their experiences of a period of time that people were disappeared, were put in detention centers, things of that nature. And they defined it as genocide. And one of my colleagues on the trip said, well, it can't be genocide because genocide has to be ethnic, religious, or national. It can't be based on ideology, which is why, you know, we were being put into disappeared or put in concentration camps in Argentina because they were leftists during that particular time. And my thinking was, can these folks define their own pain? Can they speak and give voice to what I can international law be expanded? You know, laws change all the time. And so it's important that, you know, people get to speak their own truth and make their own definition for what's going on with them and how they see the world. It doesn't have to be opposed by, you know, corporate media. It doesn't have to be imposed by academia even, you know. So we have to honor that and look at that.
Thank you for that. Among the other questions that are popping up, which is, I think, one that many people who are not heavily immersed in the scholarship that's critically assessing the narratives around protest, some people might hear the discussion that we're having and wonder if the conversation is justifying the violence in a way that is discounting the damage to business owners. So one of the questions that's coming up is, thinking about what's happening to the people whose businesses and livelihoods are being disrupted or ruined, should we then say that's just in service of the ends of these movements? That's in service of achieving progress and justice. So what do we say, one might ask, what do we say to the people whose lives have been severely disrupted or decimated as a result of this loss of property to them? What do y'all think?
Well, I think that it's a question of who's responsible for it. Again, and you don't want to see anyone have damage to their property, damage to their person. But in a situation where you don't give people political options, that becomes the main question, right? That someone's political option, their ability to speak, their ability to have effective change or avenues for effective change come about. And so I would always put the onus and the responsibility back on, and that's what I think what King was saying, you have to point to the intolerable conditions that created this situation in the first place. And let me say this too, and this is in particular light of what happened this summer. We also have to be conscious that there were also forces or political groups that were engaging in sabotage, groups who weren't in support of Black Lives Matter, groups who were white nationalists, and other groups who came into Black communities in cities during last summer's protests and tried to fan the flames, if you will. And that was certainly a factor that was well documented, that type of behavior happened. And one of the things that had caused pause with me is, again, I'm 66 years old. And when I was 11 years old, I saw the Watts uprising in 1965. And since that time, I've seen occurrences throughout the United States and generally in Black communities. When this type of spontaneous resistance happens, Black-owned stores are not touched. It's even to the point that in Watts in 65, throughout the country in 92, after the Rodney King uprisings, I went to Miami in the 80s to observe what happened there. People put up in their stores signs saying things like "Soul Brother, Black owned," and those institutions aren't touched. That didn't happen this year. And so does it suggest a different type of consciousness, or were there insertion of different social forces that were trying to take advantage of the situation? And so I think, when we look deeper into it, we're going to find that did exist.
Dr. Umoja, one of the contributions is from a scholar here at Georgia State who points to some recent social science on this, and he points to Erica Chenoweth's research from 1900 to 2006. And according to that research, campaigns of nonviolent resistance were more than twice as effective as the ones that were using other means. And the political scientist in question was asking, how would you all respond to people who might point to that? Dr. Delmas.
Yeah, so that's what I was referring to at the end of my remarks when I noted that today's movement seems to refute the received wisdom that nonviolence and civility are essential to the success of social movements. So that's absolutely right. Their book is called Why Civil Resistance Works, and it shows through a statistical analysis that nonviolent civil resistance movements were more likely to succeed. It also showed that, Erica Chenoweth, then using that same data, showed that when the participation rate hit 3.5% of the population, there was never any failure. And so that's what we're seeing now, and yet we're not really seeing something fully non-civil. So I would just say one thing. So their classification, the way they use the terminology non-violent and violent, it actually allows for some non-violent campaigns to have various radical flanks, some violent elements. So for instance, they consider the second Intifada to be non-violent, as well as the Arab Spring. So, okay, and if you consider that, no, we should really take it, take at its word what nonviolence means, and we're not seeing it today, then we seem to be seeing a not fully nonviolent movement that is garnering mass popular participation, and the same has been going on in Hong Kong, actually, massive popular participation, yet some various significant elements of incivility, and you do see the popular support. And one important reason why they say that nonviolence works is because it doesn't alienate the population, and it produces security forces defection. So something like individual soldiers and police officers' conscientious refusal to go quell peaceful protesters. And that's not what we've seen in the history of America, of course, that nonviolent peaceful protesters yield security forces defection. That's never been the case in America, and not today. And of course, part of the problem is that the very target of the protests are police. The protesters are protesting the police, so the police has not an ounce of sympathy for the most part for the protesters, except in those very well publicized cases of police officers kneeling down with the protesters and so on. So I think that the social scientific evidence is actually mixed, and that on riots, it also used to be received wisdom that riots don't work, that in '68 they led to Nixon's victory in the elections. And in fact, the research on riots also is mixed. A year later, the Stonewall riots were really instrumental to the success of the gay liberation movement and the progress towards gay rights. I think we need more research on that front. And more fine-grained at the domestic level, not just when it comes to toppling dictators,
Indeed. Natasha.
I'm just also curious, what I think a lot of these discussions of whether something's effective or not are kind of riddled with unfinished sentences. Like effective to what end and what sort of time frame are we talking about? So, how we understand an act as violent or not. For example, enslaved people leaving the plantation and escaping and forming marronage communities would have been considered violent at the time, and certainly a violence against the notions of property and order at the time, but obviously is considered bold and necessary now. And then also, are we talking about long-term frames of success? Are we talking about community building? Are we talking just about legislation? Are we talking, and every different tactic is successful or not, depending on given ends. And I'm super curious how, any given social study that says successful or not can deal with that multiplicity of ends and deal with a kind of vast span of history and what change looks like over not just decades, but centuries.
I think it's sometimes difficult to put different types of political activity and isolate it as if they're not related. Case in point, 1992, you had the Rodney King uprisings. And of course, Atlanta was one of the centers of unrest during that particular period of time. 1992, there was a tremendous amount of upsurge, particularly for young people, college students during that time. Now, later that year, inspired by that, the motion that took place during that unrest, students at Georgia State conducted a sit-in that led to the formation of the African American Studies Department. And when they tell the story, and they completely link it to the rebellions that happened that summer. many times, and again, I could say from somebody who grew up in Watts 65, that rebellion became a symbol of resistance for us growing up. And many people in my community, include myself, we speak about it with pride. So you can't separate that from other forms of political activity and other forms of political and social consciousness.
Thank you for that, Dr. Umoja. I regret that we have run out of time, and I'd like to thank our distinguished guests for kicking off this fall 2020 series, Ethics in the 2020 Elections, kicking us off so well. The conversation is just getting started, and it's certainly going to keep going on these really important issues about how ethics impacts the choices that we make as citizens and impacts the choices that policymakers make in structuring our elections. Please let me remind the viewers that this series will continue next week, Wednesday, September 9th, 2020 at 3:30 p.m. in the next installment, Healthcare Access and the 2020 Elections. My thanks once again to our panelists, Professor Candice Delmas, Natasha Lennard, and Dr. Akinyele Umoja. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you all again from the Jean Bear Blumenfeld Center for Ethics. Bye-bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was great being on this with you all. I really enjoyed what you had to say, and I want to steal it.
That was awesome.
So I want to share. Really, is Andrew, is this going to be available?
Yes, this is being recorded, and we will post it on the Jean Bear Blumenfeld Center for Ethics website once the server coughs it up to us in a couple of days.
Yeah, I want to share with colleagues and my students teaching a course on civil rights this summer, and then a graduate course on the Black Freedom Movement. So I looked on I have a graduate student, and I didn't tell about the conversation. I told my classes in general, but there's one who really needed to witness it. So I'm gonna get that from you if you could remember the
Sure enough,
information.
you'll make it publicly available. But
thanks for having me on, and I really, like I said, both of you, I'm gonna be fans of your work from now on.
Likewise.
Me
Well,
too.
you all be
Thank you. I
safe
really
now.
enjoyed it.
Yeah, I've got too much to say.
Yeah, I was going to go slide.